Hello everyone, welcome to Story Sleep. My name is Alastair Finch, and for many years I've had the pleasure of chronicling the quieter corners of our English countryside, the very warp and weft of village life. Tonight, I want to tell the story of a particular Christmas, not so long ago, in a village much like your own, a story that, for all its festive trimmings, held a shadow that only one remarkable woman could truly illuminate. It concerns Miss Jane Marple, a lady whose gentle exterior belied a mind sharper than any razor, and a heart that understood the intricate, often darker currents of human nature with an unnerving clarity. The village was Cranbrook, and the incident began, as many do, with something quite ordinary, something that, at first glance, seemed utterly harmless. But then, doesn't evil often wear the most innocuous disguise? Now, let's begin with Chapter 1 of the Case of the Christmas Village. Chapter 1, The First Snowflake. Cranbrook was, by all accounts, a model of picturesque English village life, especially as Christmas approached. Cobblestone lanes twinkled with fairy lights, holly wreaths adorned every door, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and festive baking. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her dear friend Mrs. Pemberton for the holiday season, found herself enchanted by the quaint charm, though her eyes, as always, saw more than mere surface beauty. The village's annual highlight was the grand unveiling of the Christmas Village, a meticulous miniature replica of Cranbrook itself, crafted over years by the eccentric Mr. Alastair Croft, a retired cartographer. It was displayed in the village hall, a beacon of local pride, and its unveiling marked the official start of Cranbrook's Yuletide festivities. This year, however, there was an unusual buzz, a hum of anticipation that felt slightly out of tune with the general merriment. Such a marvelous display, Miss Marple, Mrs. Pemberton remarked, stirring sugar into her tea. Mr. Croft has outdone himself. They say he's added the old mill, with a working water wheel, no less. Miss Marple nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. Indeed. Dear Margaret. Though one hopes his perfectionism doesn't consume him entirely. Such intense dedication, while admirable, can sometimes lead to unforeseen complications. Her gaze drifted to the window, where a lone figure in a dark overcoat hurried past, head down, appearing quite agitated despite the festive surroundings. It was Mr. Silas Blackwood, the village solicitor. A man known for his meticulousness and his somewhat austere demeanor. He clutched a rather bulky leather briefcase to his chest, as if it contained the secrets of the universe. The village hall, a venerable old stone building, was abuzz with activity that afternoon. Volunteers, cheerful and bustling, were putting the finishing touches on the Christmas decorations. Garlands of evergreen and scarlet ribbons draped from the rafters, and the aroma of beeswax polish mingled with the excited chatter. Mr. Croft, a slight man with spectacles perched on his nose, fussed over his miniature masterpiece. His hands, though trembling slightly with age, moved with the precision of a master craftsman, adjusting a tiny lamppost here, a miniature sheet there. He does take it all rather seriously, doesn't he? Whispered Mrs. Plummet, the vicar's wife, to Miss Marple, during a tea break. One would think the fate of the empire rested on the precise placement of a toy robin. Miss Marple merely offered a polite, non-committal hum. She had observed Mr. Croft earlier, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. There was an air of something beyond mere artistic dedication about him. A tension, a strain, that spoke of more than just a desire for perfection. He seemed almost secretive, guarding his creation with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. Later that evening, as the first snowflakes began to fall, dusting the rooftops of Cranbrook in a delicate white, the village hall doors opened for a select preview. A small group of dignitaries and village committee members gathered, Miss Marple and Mrs. Pemberton among them. The miniature village, under the glow of carefully positioned electric lights, was indeed a marvel. Tiny cottages, a church with a pealing bell, a bustling marketplace, all replicated with breathtaking accuracy. And there, at the center, was the new addition, the old mill, its tiny water wheel slowly turning. Mr. Croft, beaming, accepted the accolades with a modest bow. Yet, as Miss Marple observed, his eyes darted nervously around the room, always returning to his precious creation, as if expecting some sudden calamity. Then, just as the vicar began his brief opening remarks, a sharp gasp rippled through the small assembly. One of the miniature cottages, the one representing Elmwood Cottage, home to the rather reclusive Miss Eleanor Vance, lay shattered, as if a small, deliberate hand had crushed it. It was a jarring note in the otherwise perfect scene, a stark disruption of the festive illusion. Mr. Croft, his face drained of color, stared at the destruction, a silent scream of disbelief in his eyes. What could possess someone to commit such an act of wanton vandalism on such a beloved, intricate display? Chapter 2, A Shattered Illusion. The air in the village hall, moments before filled with genial chatter, now hung heavy with bewildered silence. Mr. Croft, his face a mask of shock, knelt beside the ruined miniature cottage, his hands hovering over the delicate splinters as if unsure whether to touch them or not. The suddenness of the act, the sheer brazenness of it under the very noses of the assembled villagers, was utterly perplexing. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mrs. Plummet, clutching her pearls. "Who could do such a thing? Such malice!" Miss Marple, however, remained outwardly calm. Her keen eye swept over the scene, not just the damaged model, but the faces of those present. Disappointment, anger, and genuine dismay were evident, but also, in some, a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps even a subtle satisfaction. Her gaze lingered on Mr. Silas Blackwood, the solicitor, who now stood a little apart. His usual austere expression replaced by a look of profound discomfort, almost fear. He avoided eye contact, his gaze fixed on a distant point on the wall. The vicar, Reverend Armitage, stepped forward, clearing his throat. Now, let us not jump to conclusions. It might have been an accident, perhaps someone bumped the table. An accident, Mr. Croft croaked, finally finding his voice, though it was hoarse with distress. He pointed to the shattered remnants. "Look! This was no accident, Vicar. It was deliberate. Someone crushed it with force." "And why Elmwood Cottage? Of all the houses, why Miss Vance's?" His voice trailed off, laden with unspoken accusation. Miss Eleanor Vance, the elderly resident of the real Elmwood Cottage, was a figure of quiet eccentricity in Cranbrook. She lived alone, rarely venturing out, her life seemingly centered around her garden and her copious collection of antique lace. Yet, for all her reclusiveness, she was not unknown to Miss Marple. Eleanor had once lived in St. Mary Mead, albeit briefly, many years ago, and Miss Marple vaguely remembered her as a rather timid, artistic young woman, prone to flights of fancy. What connection could she possibly have to such an act of deliberate vandalism? Inspector Japp, who was visiting Cranbrook on a personal matter, a weekend fishing trip, happened to be among the attendees, much to his own chagrin. His presence, though unofficial, immediately lent a more serious air to the incident. He sighed, running a hand over his moustache. "Right. Let's not crowd the area, if you please. Mr. Croft, did you see anything? Anyone near the display?" Mr. Croft wrung his hands. "No, Inspector. I was just speaking with Mrs. Plummet about the new church spire model. One moment it was perfect, the next, he gestured helplessly. And you, Miss Marple?" Japp asked, knowing her reputation well. "Any insights from your observations of human nature?" Miss Marple offered a small, polite smile. "Only that such an act, Inspector, speaks less of simple mischief and more of a deeply ingrained animosity. The choice of Elmwood Cottage, it is rather specific, wouldn't you agree? As if the miniature were merely a proxy for the real thing." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Mrs. Pemberton whispered to Miss Marple, "But Eleanor Vance is such a harmless old soul. Who could possibly bear her ill will?" Just then, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. A woman, breathless and agitated, pushed her way through. It was Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, her usually composed features contorted with alarm. "Inspector! Mr. Croft! I'm so dreadfully sorry to interrupt. But it's Miss Vance. Eleanor Vance. She hasn't been seen all day. Her cat, Mittens, is mewing pitifully on her doorstep, and the milk bottles from this morning are still there, untouched. Her kitchen window is wide open to the snow, and when Mrs. Perkins peeked in, she saw a terrible mess. As if there'd been a struggle." A collective gasp filled the hall. The shattered miniature cottage now took on a chilling new significance. The deliberate act of vandalism was no longer merely a destructive prank, it now seemed to be a grim precursor, a chilling, symbolic overture to a far more sinister event unfolding in the heart of Cranbrook. The festive illusion of the Christmas village had not just been shattered, it had been utterly eclipsed by a pervasive sense of dread. Chapter 3: The Cold Trail. The transformation of the village hall's atmosphere was immediate and profound. The initial shock over the miniature cottage now gave way to a palpable fear for Miss Eleanor Vance. Inspector Japp, his fishing trip forgotten, immediately took charge. He dispatched a constable to Elmwood Cottage, with strict instructions to secure the scene. Miss Marple watched the unfolding drama with a quiet intensity. The shift from a petty act of vandalism to a potential disappearance, possibly even a crime, was a pattern she had observed many times. In St. Mary Mead, small, seemingly innocuous acts often served as the first ripples in a much larger, darker pool. "A terrible business, Miss Marple," Mrs. Pemberton murmured, her hand pressed to her chest. "Poor Eleanor. She never harmed a soul." "Indeed, Margaret," Miss Marple replied, her gaze still fixed on the shattered miniature. "But sometimes, it is not what one asterisk does asterisk, but what one asterisk has asterisk, or what one asterisk knows asterisk, that puts one in peril." The constable returned from Elmwood Cottage within the hour, his face grim. "Inspector, it's just as Mrs. Finch said. The house is in disarray. Furniture overturned, papers scattered. No sign of Miss Vance, sir. And a window in the study appears to have been forced open. Looks like a forced entry, perhaps a struggle inside." Japp's lips thinned. "Right. A full team needed. This is no longer a simple missing person case. It's moved into criminal territory. Mr. Croft, I'll need a list of everyone who had access to the hall today, especially those who were near your display." Mr. Croft, still visibly shaken, mumbled, "But why? Why would someone do this to Eleanor? And smash my cottage? Perhaps the two are connected, Mr. Croft," Miss Marple interjected gently. "The shattering of the miniature may have been a message, or a diversion. Or perhaps, the true target was always the real Elmwood cottage. And the miniature merely a practice run, a testing of the waters, so to speak. Japp looked at her, a hint of respect in his eyes. A good point, Miss Marple. We'll certainly be looking into that. And for now, everyone, please refrain from discussing this with outsiders. We don't want to cause undue panic. As the crowd dispersed, whispering nervously, Miss Marple lingered by the display. She knelt, examining the fragments of the miniature Elmwood cottage. The tiny, perfectly rendered walls, the delicate roof shingles, all now reduced to splinters. Her fingers traced the rough edges, feeling the sharp breaks. It struck her that the destruction had been rather crude, almost brutal, inconsistent with the delicate nature of the miniature itself, and indeed, with the generally peaceful atmosphere of Cranbrook. Her gaze then drifted to the surrounding miniatures. The tiny church, the general store, the old mill with its slowly turning wheel. And then, her eyes landed on a detail she had not noticed before. Tucked away beside the miniature mill, almost hidden by a cluster of tiny painted trees, was a minuscule figure. It was a man, barely an inch tall, but crafted with the same meticulous detail as the rest of the village. He stood near a tiny, intricately depicted stream, his back to the viewer, seemingly observing the water. This figure was unusual because, unlike the other static elements, it appeared to have been added recently. Mr. Croft had only mentioned adding the mill. Why had he not mentioned this little man? And why was he positioned in such an obscure spot? Miss Marple felt a prickle of intuition. This wasn't just a charming addition, it felt deliberate, almost like a hidden signature. A signature that, at this moment, might be crucial. She straightened up, a thoughtful expression on her face. The police would focus on the forced entry and the missing woman. But Miss Marple sensed that the key to Eleanor Vance's disappearance, and perhaps to the identity of the person who shattered the miniature cottage, lay not just in the real world of Cranbrook, but also within the meticulously crafted confines of Mr. Croft's Christmas village itself. The little man by the stream, so easily overlooked, suddenly seemed to hold a silent, significant clue, a secret whispered in miniature. Chapter 4. Whispers and Shadows. The search for Eleanor Vance intensified throughout Cranbrook. Constables fanned out, questioning neighbors, scrutinizing the snowy lanes for any tracks, but the falling snow had quickly erased any potential evidence. The general mood in the village was one of disquiet, a sense of violated peace had replaced the earlier festive cheer. Inspector Japp, now officially heading the investigation, established a temporary command post in the village hall, much to Mr. Croft's thinly veiled annoyance. Japp began interviewing residents, piecing together Eleanor Vance's last known movements and trying to uncover any hidden animosities she might have harbored. Miss Marple, observing from a polite distance, found herself engaged in her own, more subtle form of investigation. She listened to the murmurs of the villagers, piecing together the tapestry of Cranbrook's social fabric. She knew that in a small community, everyone had their secrets, their grudges, and their unspoken histories. One particular figure quickly came under gentle scrutiny, Mr. Silas Blackwood, the solicitor. He was a bachelor, known for his formidable intellect and his rather cold, calculating nature. He handled most of the village's legal affairs, including, as it happened, Eleanor Vance's modest investments. Miss Marple had noticed his agitated demeanor earlier and the way he had conspicuously avoided the shattered miniature. Japp, having just finished an interview with a flustered Mrs. Finch, approached Miss Marple. Still no luck, I'm afraid. Miss Vance kept largely To herself. No obvious enemies, no financial woes, nothing to suggest she'd simply run off. The house was definitely ransacked, though not meticulously. It almost felt performative. As if to make a point. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, Inspector. And what of Mr. Blackwood? He struck me as rather ill at ease this morning. Japp raised an eyebrow. Blackwood? He says he was at his office all day, working on a complex land dispute concerning the old mill. Claims he left just before the hall opened, briefly popped in, and left when the commotion started. Says he found it all rather distasteful. And his connection to Miss Vance. He was her solicitor. Handled her will, her investments. Nothing untoward, as far as we can tell. He seems a pillar of the community, if a rather stiff one. Japp paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, he did mention he was in the midst of updating Miss Vance's will recently. Said she had some new instructions, rather unexpected ones, about a significant bequest. This piece of information, though delivered casually, immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. A significant bequest, you say? To whom? He wouldn't say, citing client confidentiality. But he did imply it was not to any expected relative. Said Miss Vance had always been rather unpredictable in her affections. Japp shrugged. Could be nothing, of course. People change their wills all the time. But Miss Marple knew better. In a quiet life like Eleanor Vance's, a sudden, unexpected bequest could very well be the spark that ignited a dangerous ambition. It suggested a shift in the delicate balance of power, a potential disappointment for someone who might have been expecting to benefit. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Plummet, the vicar's wife, arranging flowers for the upcoming Christmas service. Mrs. Plummet, ever the fount of local gossip, leaned in conspiratorially. You know, Miss Marple, Mr. Blackwood and Eleanor Vance had a rather heated discussion just last week. I overheard them, quite by accident, near the old mill pond. He seemed very agitated, and she, for her part, was uncharacteristically firm. Something about immoral obligations and righting a wronged dot. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind buzzing. Moral obligations. Righting a wrong. And the unexpected bequest. It painted a picture of Eleanor Vance, not as the timid recluse, but as someone exercising a newfound resolve, perhaps even challenging someone. And Mr. Blackwood, the austere solicitor, seemed to be directly involved. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the snow-covered village, Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Pemberton's cosy parlour. She considered the day's discoveries, the forced entry, the ransacked house, the missing woman, the suspicious solicitor, and the shattered miniature. And, of course, the unexpected little figure hidden within Mr. Croft's display. All these threads, disparate as they seemed, felt connected. The shattered miniature Elmwood Cottage now seemed less like a proxy for a real house, and more like a symbolic gesture, a warning perhaps, aimed at a very specific, and now seemingly absent, Eleanor Vance. But what secret did she possess, or what action had she taken, that had stirred such dangerous currents in Cranbrook? Chapter 5 of The Ghost in the Village. The following morning brought a lead, albeit a grim one. A group of carol singers, practicing near the old mill pond, discovered a woman's woolen scarf snagged on a thorny bush by the water's edge. It was identified by Mrs. Finch as unequivocally belonging to Eleanor Vance. The scarf was damp and muddy, and a few threads were torn, suggesting a struggle or a frantic attempt to break free. The mill pond, a deep and murky expanse of water, was immediately dragged by the police. The atmosphere in Cranbrook grew heavier. The hope of Eleanor merely having wandered off or been kidnapped for ransom began to recede, replaced by a colder, more chilling apprehension. Miss Marple, hearing the news, felt a pang of sorrow for the gentle Eleanor. Yet, her mind continued to work, connecting the recent events to the patterns of human behavior she knew so well. The location of the scarf was particularly intriguing, the old mill pond. This was the same spot where Mrs. Plummet had overheard the argument between Eleanor Vance and Silas Blackwood. It was also the exact spot replicated with such meticulous detail, complete with the little hidden figure, in Mr. Croft's Christmas village. The confluence of these details felt too precise to be mere coincidence. Inspector Japp, looking weary, discussed the development with Miss Marple. "We found no body in the pond, Miss Marple, but the scarf is undeniable. It strongly suggests foul play, or at least a tragic accident. Here." But no one heard a cry, no one saw anything. "The scarf could have been placed there, Inspector," Miss Marple suggested gently. "A deliberate attempt to mislead, to make us believe a body lies within the pond's depths, rather than elsewhere. Or perhaps, to point suspicion towards the mill itself." Japp frowned. "Towards the mill? What makes you say that?" Miss Marple merely smiled faintly. "Just a feeling, Inspector. Sometimes, the most elaborate deceptions are built upon the simplest of misdirections." Later, she decided to visit Mr. Croft, ostensibly to offer her condolences for the damaged miniature, but primarily to learn more about the tiny figure by the mill stream. She found him in the village hall, meticulously repairing the miniature Elmwood cottage, his face still drawn with worry. "A terrible business about Miss Vance," Miss Marple began, watching his delicate work. "And about your beautiful display. I noticed you've added a new figure by the mill stream. Is he a specific villager, or just a generic addition?" Mr. Croft stiffened, his hand hovering over a miniature chimney. "Oh, just a small detail, Miss Marple. An afterthought. A fisherman. Perhaps." His voice was unnaturally strained. "He seems rather particular," Miss Marple pressed gently. "And so carefully hidden. Almost as if he wasn't meant to be discovered." Mr. Croft turned, his spectacles glinting. "I assure you, Miss Marple, he is of no consequence. Simply a whimsical addition." His eyes, however, betrayed his words. There was a nervousness, a defensiveness that suggested he was indeed hiding something. His gaze darted to the miniature mill itself, then back to Miss Marple, as if weighing a secret. Miss Marple decided not to push further. She had learned enough. Mr. Croft was clearly uncomfortable discussing the figure. But why? Could the tiny man represent someone real? And if so, what was his significance to the mill, to Eleanor Vance, and to the escalating mystery? As she left the hall, she saw Silas Blackwood emerging from his office, carrying another bulky briefcase. He glanced her way, a fleeting flicker of something, apprehensio. Guilt, in his eyes, before quickly averting his gaze and hurrying away. He was heading in the direction of Elmwood Cottage, perhaps to retrieve papers for the police, or perhaps for another, more personal reason. The scarf by the mill pond had been a clear signal, but Miss Marple felt it was a feint. The true ghost in the village was not a body in the water, but a secret that someone was desperately trying to bury. And the miniature figure by the mill, Mr. Croft's secret addition, felt increasingly like a clue to the identity of this ghost, and to the dark truth that Cranbrook was struggling to conceal beneath its festive veneer. The village, for all its charm, was beginning to reveal its hidden shadows. Chapter 6: A Shadow of a Past. The mystery surrounding Eleanor Vance deepened with each passing hour. The police, despite their thorough search of the mill pond and the surrounding countryside, found no further trace of her. The discovery of the scarf remained the sole concrete piece of evidence, yet it now felt increasingly like a carefully placed distraction. Miss Marple, meanwhile, began to connect the dots in her own quiet way. She decided to pay a visit to Elmwood Cottage, now secured by the police. Inspector Japp, though initially reluctant, allowed her in, respecting her unusual knack for noticing the seemingly inconsequential. The cottage was indeed a scene of disarray, but Miss Marple found herself drawn to the study, where the window had allegedly been forced. The room was untidy, as though someone had frantically searched for something. Books were strewn, drawers pulled open. Yet, what struck Miss Marple was not the chaos, but a small, neat pile of lace samples on a desk, undisturbed. Eleanor Vance's passion for antique lace was well known, and it seemed unlikely a hurried intruder would leave such delicate, valuable items untouched, unless their search was for something entirely different. As Japp meticulously documented the scene, Miss Marple's eye scanned the bookshelves. Amidst volumes on horticulture and art, she spotted a worn copy of a local history book, A Chronicle of Cranbrook. It was open, face down, near a discarded teacup. Gently, Miss Marple picked it up. A faded photograph was tucked inside, serving as a bookmark. It depicted a group of young people gathered by the old mill, laughing, dressed in fashions of a bygone era. Among them, a younger, rather pretty Eleanor Vance, standing close to a handsome young man with a proud, almost defiant, look in his eyes. And tucked away, almost hidden behind Eleanor, was a much younger, more timid Silas Blackwood, barely recognizable. "Ah, a bit of local history," Japp commented, glancing over. Miss Vance was quite the local historian in her quiet way. Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was racing. The photograph showed a different side to these individuals, a youthful energy and connection that had long since faded. The young man with Eleanor, in particular, intrigued her. He had a striking resemblance to Mr. Croft, though clearly not the same person. Could he be a relative? A brother, perhaps? She excused herself shortly after, her thoughts turning to Mr. Croft. The meticulous cartographer, the hidden figure by the mill, the fierce pride in his work, and now this photograph. There was a historical thread woven into the present mystery. Back at Mrs. Pemberton's, Miss Marple pondered the implications. The argument between Eleanor and Blackwood about righting a wrong. The unexpected bequest, the mill pond as a possible misdirection, and now this old photograph. It suggested a secret from the past, a shared history between Eleanor, Blackwood, and perhaps someone connected to the Croft family. She recalled a snippet of village gossip she'd heard days ago from Mrs. Finch about the Croft family. "They say the Crofts used to own the mill, dear. Generations of them. But there was some terrible business, a scandal, years ago, and they lost everything. Mr. Alastair Croft, the one who built the miniature, he never really recovered from the family shame, though he inherited what little remained. Always kept himself apart, you know." This snippet, combined with the photograph, suddenly clicked into place. The young man in the photograph, the one resembling Croft, could be Mr. Croft's father, or an uncle. If the Crofts lost the mill due to a scandal, and Eleanor Vance, with Silas Blackwood's assistance, was looking to right a wrong with an unexpected bequest, the pieces began to align. The shattered miniature of Elmwood Cottage, the disappearance of Eleanor Vance, and the specific focus on the mill pond. It all pointed to a long-buried secret, a ghost from Cranbrook's past that had finally returned to haunt the present. Eleanor Vance, in her quiet way, had seemingly unearthed this secret. And in doing so, had placed herself in grave danger. The meticulous Mr. Croft and the austere Mr. Blackwood, both seemingly upstanding members of the community, appeared to be central figures in this unfolding historical drama. The past, Miss Marple realized, was never truly past in a village like Cranbrook. It lay dormant, like old grievances, waiting for the right moment to erupt. Chapter 7. Echoes of Betrayal. Miss Marple's growing conviction that the mystery had its roots in Cranbrook's past led her to Mrs. Henderson, a delightful but undeniably gossipy old lady, known for her encyclopedic memory of local lore. Over tea and shortbread, Miss Marple subtly steered the conversation towards the old mill and the Croft family. Ah, the mill, Mrs. Henderson sighed, a faraway look in her eyes. Such a tragedy, that was. Not long after the Great War, it was. The Crofts, you see, were proud millers for generations. Old Mr. Ebenezer Croft, Alastair's father, he was a good man, but a dreamer. Always tinkering, never quite practical enough for business. And then came the new machinery, the big industrial mills, and small places like ours struggled. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. But the real downfall, Miss Marple, was Mr. Percival Blackwood, Silas's father. A shrewd lawyer, he was. He offered to help Ebenezer, advised him on a new loan, a new business venture. It was all very complex, legalistic. And then, well, the venture failed spectacularly. Ebenezer was ruined. Lost the mill, his family home, everything. They said Percival Blackwood was merely a competent lawyer, but there were whispers of him taking advantage, of exploiting Ebenezer's naivety. Percival acquired the mill at a pittance, then quickly sold it off for a fortune. The Crofts were left with nothing but their pride and a tiny cottage on the edge of the village. Miss Marple listened intently, connecting this narrative to the photograph of the young Eleanor Vance with Ebenezer Croft, and the younger Silas Blackwood. It was a classic tale of village betrayal, an old wound left unhealed. The wrong Eleanor Vance spoke of the moral obligation, now made perfect sense. She was likely trying to right the historical injustice perpetrated against the Croft family by Silas Blackwood's father. And Eleanor Vance? Miss Marple asked casually. What was her connection to all this? Eleanor? Well, she was quite smitten with young Ebenezer, Mrs. Henderson chuckled. They were sweethearts, before all the trouble. She always felt terrible for him, heartbroken, really. She even tried to offer him some of her small inheritance back then, but he was too proud to take it. After he lost everything, she moved away for a while, couldn't bear to see the family struggle. But she always kept an eye on them, I hear. This revelation was crucial. Eleanor Vance, not just an acquaintance, but Ebenezer Croft's former sweetheart, and a silent observer of the injustice. Her return to Cranbrook and her intention to amend her will were clearly an attempt to atone for the past. To compensate Alastair Croft for his family's historical losses, perhaps through the significant bequest Blackwood had mentioned. Miss Marple understood now the potential motives. Silas Blackwood, a man fiercely protective of his family's reputation and wealth, would be horrified if Eleanor Vance were to publicly expose his father's actions or, worse, use her money to compensate the Crofts. Effectively admitting guilt. and Mr. Alastair Croft, a man haunted by his family's past, obsessed with the mill, and now faced with a chance to redeem his family name. The potential for a volatile reaction was immense. The tiny figure in the Christmas village, the one so carefully hidden by the mill stream, suddenly gained a new, poignant significance. Was it a representation of Ebenezer Croft, forever standing watch over his lost inheritance? And the shattered miniature Elmwood cottage? A direct warning to Eleanor to cease her efforts to revisit the past? As Miss Marple walked back through the snow-laden lanes, the quiet beauty of Cranbrook felt deceptive. Beneath the tranquil surface, old grievances festered, and the pursuit of justice, or perhaps vengeance, could be a powerful, destructive force. Eleanor Vance, in seeking to right an old wrong, had inadvertently stirred up a hornet's nest. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, and Miss Marple realized that the perpetrator was not merely attempting to hide a crime, but to bury a painful truth that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed facade of respectability in Cranbrook. Chapter 8. The Shadowed Stream. The revelations regarding the Croft family and the Blackwoods provided Miss Marple with a clearer lens through which to view the mystery. She now understood the powerful undercurrents of resentment and injustice that ran beneath the seemingly placid surface of Cranbrook. Eleanor Vance, by attempting to redistribute wealth to atone for a past wrong, had disturbed a hornet's nest. Inspector Japp, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated. The dragnet of the mill pond had yielded nothing, and the search for Eleanor Vance continued to be fruitless. There were no new witnesses, no further clues, and the forced entry at Elmwood Cottage now seemed less like a simple break-in for valuables and more like a deliberate act designed to confuse. "It's as if she vanished into thin air, Miss Marple," Japp confessed, rubbing his temples. "And the more we dig, the less sense it makes. No real signs of a struggle in the house, despite the mess. It's almost too theatrical." "Perhaps, Inspector," Miss Marple suggested, "the perpetrator wished it to appear as a struggle. A staged event, much like a play. And if so, we should look for the actor, not merely the props." She then subtly steered the conversation back to the Christmas village. "Mr. Croft's miniature, Inspector. You recall the small figure by the mill stream?" Japp frowned. "The little fisherman? I told him to remove it, clutters the scene." "What of it?" "Mr. Croft seemed rather protective of it," Miss Marple observed. "And Mrs. Henderson mentioned that the old mill pond was where Ebenezer Croft, the one whose family lost the mill, often went to reflect. It was his favorite spot." Japp scoffed lightly. "A coincidence, surely. Mr. Croft is simply an eccentric old artist. Or a storyteller, Inspector. Sometimes, the truth is told in symbols, not words." Miss Marple paused. "If Ebenezer Croft loved that spot by the mill stream, and Mr. Croft has recreated it with such fidelity, even adding a figure that might represent his ancestor, then perhaps the key lies not in the mill pond itself, but in the vicinity, or in what it represents." That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to revisit the real mill pond, this time with a specific focus on the spot where the miniature figure stood. The snow had continued to fall intermittently, creating a fresh, pristine blanket. As she approached the pond, she noticed the faintest of impressions in the snow, partially obscured by a fresh dusting. Not footprints, but a series of small, shallow depressions. As if something heavy had been dragged, or perhaps, placed with care. They led from the path, across a small, less trodden area near the mill race, and then stopped abruptly at the edge of the water, near a cluster of old, gnarled willow trees. Her heart gave a little flutter. This was the exact spot depicted by the miniature figure. Miss Marple carefully knelt, brushing away the fresh snow. Beneath, she found a series of tiny, almost imperceptible indentations. It wasn't a body that had been dragged, it was something else. And then, her gaze fell upon a small, glinting object caught in the icy mud at the very edge of the mill race, partially submerged. It was a miniature button of the kind used on delicate garments, intricate and old-fashioned. Miss Marple carefully extricated it. It was made of mother-of-pearl, exquisitely carved with a tiny floral pattern. It looked Victorian, the kind of button one might find on a lady's antique blouse or cloak. It certainly did not belong to any rough-and-tumble rural activity, nor did it appear to be the sort of button a modern villager would wear. It bespoke of a different era, a different kind of attire. She turned the button over. In her palm, her mind racing. An antique button, found at the very spot where the mill pond and the mill race met, where Eleanor Vance's scarf had supposedly been lost, and where Mr. Croft had placed his hidden miniature figure. This was no mere coincidence. This was a direct, tangible clue. The discovery sent a shiver down her spine, not of fear, but of profound understanding. The ghost of the mill, the old betrayal, was not just a memory. It had a physical presence, a tangible link to the present crime. This button, so small and unassuming, felt like a vital piece of the puzzle, a silent testament to an event that had occurred here, far more subtle than a violent struggle, and perhaps, more profound than a simple disappearance. The true nature of Eleanor Vance's fate, Miss Marple now suspected, lay not in the cold depths of the mill pond, but in something far more intricate and carefully orchestrated, a deception woven with threads from both past and present. Chapter 9, The Weaver's Thread. The mother-of-pearl button, gleaming faintly in Miss Marple's palm, felt cold and ancient. It was a delicate object, out of place amidst the mud and ice of the mill race. Its discovery shifted the focus of her deductions, away from a dramatic struggle and toward something more subtle, more precise. She took the button back to Mrs. Pemberton's, where she examined it under a magnifying glass. The floral carving was exquisite, a testament to craftsmanship of a bygone era. It was distinctly feminine and old-fashioned. Miss Marple immediately thought of Eleanor Vance's love for antique lace and fabrics. Could this button have belonged to Eleanor herself? Inspector Japp, informed of the discovery, sent a constable to the scene. The constable, however, found no further evidence, only the subtle impressions in the snow Miss Marple had described. Seems like a rather old button, Miss Marple, Japp concluded, holding it carefully. Could have been there for years, washed up from the pond. Perhaps, Inspector, Miss Marple replied mildly. But consider its placement. Precisely where the miniature figure stands in Mr. Croft's display, a spot connected to Ebenezer Croft and Miss Vance's history. And consider the shallow impressions in the snow, suggesting something carefully placed, or perhaps delicately arranged. Her words seemed to spark a thought in Japp, who then sent the button to a forensic expert for analysis, hoping for any fibers or residue. Miss Marple, however, pursued a different line of inquiry. She decided to visit Mr. Silas Blackwood once more. She found him in his meticulously ordered office, surrounded by stacks of legal tomes. He looked increasingly drawn and anxious, a man under immense pressure. Mr. Blackwood, Miss Marple began gently, I understand Miss Vance was in the process of amending her will. You mentioned a significant, unexpected bequest. Blackwood's face tightened. Client confidentiality, Miss Marple. I cannot possibly discuss the details. Indeed, she acknowledged. But can you confirm that her intention was to make restitution to the Croft family for past injustices regarding the mill? Blackwood flinched, his composure momentarily cracking. He stared at her, his lips pressed into a thin line. That is a highly sensitive matter, Miss Marple. And entirely speculative. Speculative, perhaps, Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. But let us consider the implications. If Miss Vance were to make such a bequest, it would, in essence, publicly acknowledge the regrettable circumstances surrounding your father's acquisition of the mill. It would cast a shadow upon your family's esteemed name, and indeed, upon your own standing in the community. Blackwood stood abruptly, his knuckles white as he gripped his desk. Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that I had something to do with Eleanor Vance's disappearance? That I would harm her to protect my family's reputation? His voice was sharp, laced with indignation, but beneath it, Miss Marple detected a tremor of fear. I am merely exploring motives, Mr. Blackwood, Miss Marple responded, her gaze steady. And reputation, in a village such as Cranbrook, can be a most powerful motive. More powerful, perhaps, than mere money. She then showed him the antique button. Have you seen this before, Mr. Blackwood? It was found by the mill race. Blackwood looked at the button, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. He quickly composed himself. No. Never. It appears to be an old item. Has no bearing on this unfortunate affair. But his denial felt too quick, too vehement. He had recognized it, Miss Marple was certain. As Miss Marple left, she passed Mr. Croft, who was entering Blackwood's office. Their expressions were equally grim, their faces etched with a shared, unspoken tension. It was clear that the historical wrong weighed heavily on both men, albeit for different reasons. Miss Marple now had a clearer picture. Silas Blackwood had a strong motive to prevent Eleanor Vance's will from being enacted. But he seemed too cautious, too meticulous to simply resort to violence. And the button was an anomaly. It felt less like a sign of struggle and more like a carefully placed artifact. Who would possess such a button? And how did it relate to that staged event Japp spoke of? The weave of the mystery was becoming tighter. But one thread, the most delicate and beautiful of all, held the key to untangling it entirely. Chapter 10, The Unseen Thread. The forensic report on the mother-of-pearl button arrived, confirming Miss Marple's suspicions. The expert determined it was indeed a very old button, likely Victorian, and its delicate nature meant it was unlikely to have been long exposed to the elements. More significantly, faint traces of silk fibers were found embedded in its crevices, consistent with the kind of fabric used in antique lace garments. This reinforced the link to Eleanor Vance's specific interest. Inspector Japp remained perplexed. So, Miss Vance wore an old silk garment near the mill race, lost a button, and then vanished. Still doesn't explain what happened to her. Indeed, Inspector, Miss Marple agreed. But it does narrow down the possibilities. And the silk fibers suggest a carefulness, a precision, rather than a frantic, violent struggle. Think of a weaver, Inspector. They work with delicate threads, creating intricate patterns. Sometimes, to make a new pattern, they must cut an old thread, but they do so with careful intent. Not with brute force. Japp grumbled, still preferring a more straightforward criminal narrative. Miss Marple then shared another observation. She had visited the real Elmwood cottage again. This time focusing on the window that was supposedly forced open. On closer inspection, and only visible to her experienced eye, she noticed a faint, almost invisible scratch on the paintwork of the window frame, not from a jimmying tool, but from something smaller, perhaps a thin wire or a delicate instrument. And nearby, hidden amongst the ivy, a small, meticulously tied knot of thin, dark twine. It was the kind of twine used for gardening, or perhaps, for securing small packages. It seemed incongruous with a violent break-in. If the intention was to make it look like a forced entry, Inspector, Miss Marple suggested, one might not use crude tools, but something subtler, less damaging, if one also wished to access the house regularly without drawing attention. This led her to a new train of thought. Who would have the knowledge, the skill, and the motivation to create such an elaborate, yet subtle, deception? Someone meticulous, precise, perhaps even artistic. Someone who built miniature villages with incredible detail. Her thoughts turned to Mr. Alastair Croft. His obsession with his Christmas village, his almost pathological need for perfection, his history with the mill and the Blackwood family. He had a deep, personal connection to the injustice that Eleanor Vance was trying to right. And his reaction to the destroyed miniature, not just anger, but a deep, almost visceral distress, as if the miniature was a reflection of a deeper, more personal pain. Miss Marple remembered his peculiar nervousness when she asked about the tiny hidden figure by the mill stream. She also recalled the shattered miniature Elmwood cottage. It was destroyed by a small, deliberate hand, as Mr. Croft himself had put it. But if he was so protective of his work, why would he allow such destruction? Unless he himself was the one who destroyed it. The idea, once formed, felt chillingly plausible. If Eleanor Vance was planning to right the wrong, a public bequest would be a massive vindication for the Croft family. It would mean the restoration of their honor. But what if Alastair Croft, a man obsessed with his family's past, and perhaps harboring a deep-seated resentment for the shame, had his own, more extreme, idea of justice? What if he didn't want a mere bequest, a handout? What if he wanted something more? Perhaps the shame of his family, the loss of the mill, had warped his perception of right and wrong, twisting it into a desire for something more absolute, more symbolic. Miss Marple then remembered Mr. Blackwood's agitated encounter with Eleanor Vance by the mill pond. Moral obligations and righting a wrong. What if Eleanor's actions, however well-intentioned, were perceived as insufficient, or even an insult, by the proud and perhaps disturbed Alastair Croft? The carefully arranged scene at Elmwood Cottage, the misdirection of the scarf at the mill pond, the antique button, the miniature figure by the stream, and the shattered miniature cottage, all began to coalesce into a single, intricate design. A design that spoke of a disturbed, meticulous mind, orchestrating a complex charade. The unseen thread, Miss Marple realized, connected not just the past and the present, but the physical world of Cranbrook with the carefully constructed, symbolic world of the Christmas village. And the weaver of this thread was someone deeply entrenched in both. Chapter 11, The Unmasking. The pieces of the puzzle, painstakingly gathered and subtly arranged, now formed a coherent, albeit chilling, picture in Miss Marple's mind. She felt a profound sadness, for the truth, once revealed, often brought more sorrow than satisfaction. It was time for the unmasking. Inspector Japp, still wrestling with the lack of concrete evidence for Eleanor Vance's whereabouts, agreed to Miss Marple's suggestion of an informal gathering. He called together Mr. Silas Blackwood, Mr. Alastair Croft, Mrs. Plummet, and a few other key villagers in the parlour of Mrs. Pemberton's house. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, the festive air of Christmas now utterly forgotten. Miss Marple, knitting placidly, began to speak, her voice soft but clear. "We are all greatly distressed by Miss Vance's disappearance. The police have worked tirelessly, yet the truth remains elusive. But perhaps, if we look beyond what is immediately obvious, and consider human nature, the picture might become clearer." She recounted the story of the Croft family and the mill, the injustice perpetrated by Percival Blackwood, and Eleanor Vance's intention to right that historical wrong through her will. Silas Blackwood squirmed, his face pale, but remained silent. Alastair Croft, however, listened with a rigid stillness, his eyes fixed on Miss Marple. Miss Vance, Miss Marple continued, was a kind woman, but perhaps a little naive in her understanding of how deeply old wounds can fester. She intended to make a significant bequest to Mr. Alastair Croft, a form of compensation for his family's losses. Silas Blackwood finally spoke, his voice strained. "Miss Marple, how could you possibly know the details of a client's will? Such things have a way of surfacing in a village." "Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But you, Mr. Blackwood, had a strong motive to prevent this. Not necessarily to harm Miss Vance, but to protect your family's reputation. A public acknowledgement of your father's actions would have been devastating for you. I believe you argued with Miss Vance, urging her against this course of action. You were, perhaps, hoping to quietly manage the bequest without public scrutiny." Blackwood slumped, defeated. Yes, he admitted quietly. "I did argue with her. I begged her to reconsider. It would have ruined my father's name. I would never have harmed her, though. I swear it." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you, Mr. Blackwood. You are a man who prizes order and discretion. Violence would be quite out of character for you. But someone else, someone whose pain ran deeper, whose sense of justice was perhaps more twisted, might have seen Miss Vance's actions differently." She then turned her gaze to Alastair Croft. "Mr. Croft, you are a master craftsman. Your Christmas village is a testament to your meticulousness, your precision, your artistry, and your deep connection to the history of Cranbrook, particularly the mill. You recreated the mill with such care, even adding a tiny figure by the stream, a figure that represents your ancestor, Ebenezer Croft, perpetually watching his lost inheritance." Croft's hands, resting on his knees, began to tremble. "You, Mr. Croft," Miss Marple went on, her voice filled with a quiet certainty, "were the only one who truly understood the depth of your family's historical shame. And while Miss Vance intended to offer a kind of reparation, perhaps you saw it not as restitution, but as a charitable handout, a further reminder of your family's humiliation. You wanted more than money, didn't you, Mr. Croft? You wanted vindication. You wanted the mill, the symbol of your family's honor, to be truly returned, not merely compensated for. And when Miss Vance refused to alter her will to directly involve the mill's ownership, you grew angry. Terribly, terribly angry." Alastair Croft's face was now ashen. He tried to speak, but no words came. "You shattered the miniature Elmwood cottage, not as a random act of vandalism," Miss Marple concluded, her voice unwavering, "but as a warning. A symbolic act of destruction aimed at Miss Vance. And when that failed to deter her, you took matters into your own hands. You used your meticulous skill, not for art, but for a meticulously planned deception." Inspector Japp, who had been listening with growing astonishment, finally grasped the full implication. "Then, Miss Vance isn't just missing, is she, Miss Marple? She's been murdered. And you know where her body is, don't you, Mr. Croft?" The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Alastair Croft, his eyes wide with a desperate, trapped look, stared at Miss Marple. He opened his mouth, but only a choked sob escaped. He was cornered, his carefully constructed illusion shattered by the gentle, but relentless, unraveling of Miss Marple's insights. The truth, like a cold winter wind, had finally swept through Cranbrook, exposing the long-buried secrets beneath its picturesque facade. Chapter 12, The Mill and the Moral. Alastair Croft finally broke a low, guttural cry escaping his lips. He buried his face in his hands, trembling uncontrollably. "It wasn't how I intended it," he choked out, his voice hoarse with despair. "She wouldn't listen. She just wanted to give money, a charity. But the mill was our birthright. It was stolen. I just wanted her to understand." He lifted his head, his eyes wild with a mixture of grief and madness. "I staged the forced entry at Elmwood Cottage. I used a thin wire, a trick I learned as a boy, to open the window without breaking anything. I ransacked the place myself, to make it look like a robbery. But I only wanted her to know my anger. To make her see that a mere bequest wasn't enough." "But what happened to Miss Vance, Mr. Croft?" Japp pressed, his voice firm but controlled. Croft's gaze dropped. "She came to the mill pond later that day. I'd arranged to meet her. I begged her, pleaded with her to change the terms of her will, to insist that the mill be returned to the Crofts, not just compensation. She said it was too complicated, too late. She said she felt she was doing the right thing by simply giving money. And then she threatened to tell everyone about my unhealthy obsession if I didn't stop bothering her. She called me mad." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I pushed her. We were by the mill race, near the old gears. She fell. Hit her head. She was gone. Just like that." He gestured helplessly, his hand still trembling. "I panicked. I couldn't let them find her there, by the mill. It would prove everything I'd said about the mill, about the injustice. It would confirm my obsession." "So you disposed of her body?" Japp asked, horrified. Croft nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I wrapped her in an old canvas, weighted it down with stones, and sank her in a deep, forgotten part of the mill race, where the current is strongest. The scarf. I placed it by the pond to make it look like she'd drowned there, or fallen in by accident. I even dropped one of her old buttons, from a dress I remembered she used to wear, to make it look convincing. To connect her to the mill pond, but away from the actual mill gears." He paused, then added, his voice regaining a chilling, almost proud, inflection. "The miniature man by the stream. That was Ebenezer. My father. Watching. He would have approved. She wronged him, too, in her own way, by not fully understanding the depth of our suffering." Miss Marple sighed, a profound sadness settling upon her. "Ah, Mr. Croft. The weight of the past. It can warp a man's perception of justice, turning it into a monstrous thing. Miss Vance's intentions were good, if perhaps misguided in their execution. But your actions, in attempting to right a historical wrong, have created a new, far greater one." The local constables were immediately dispatched to the specific location in the mill race Croft had described. Within hours, Eleanor Vance's body was recovered, bearing a clear head injury consistent with a fall. the meticulous details of Croft's confession, including the method of concealment and the placement of the scarf and button, matched the evidence. Silas Blackwood, though innocent of murder, faced the ignominy of his family's past being publicly aired. The village of Cranbrook, though relieved to have the mystery solved, was left with a heavy heart, its festive spirit irrevocably tarnished. The Christmas village, Mr. Croft's pride and joy, would forever be a symbol of hidden malice and shattered dreams. Miss Marple, as she prepared to return to St. Mary Mead, reflected on the case. It was a familiar story, human nature with its tangled web of pride, resentment, and misguided intentions, always leading to tragic consequences. The lesson, as always, was that the surface beauty of a village could conceal the darkest human passions, and that justice,